Welcome, everybody, to the American Space Museum. I'm Marquette, and we know you're here to stay curious with a tremendous guest that I've been researching and can't wait to talk to Gary Johnson. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Tell everyone where you're coming. You're here. We are on a Google Meets, and you are in Clear Lake, Houston, suburb of Texas, correct?
Houston, Texas, and it's a suburb referred to as Clear Lake, which is only a couple of miles from the Space Center, Johnson Space Center.
Well, I've been there, and I hope our Stay Curious listeners have got it on the bucket list if they haven't gone there. What's one of your favorite things there at the Space Center, Gary, for a tourist attraction for us tourists?
Well, for me, it's fishing with my grandkids in Clear Lake and the Gulf. But in terms of tourists here, then of course, Space Center Houston as a facility to go visit. And then, of course, you've got also in Galveston, you have Moody
Mm-hmm.
Gardens down there, and you have
Gary, what's your favorite? I wanted to ask you, what was your favorite thing in Johnson Space Center? What of all the wonderful exhibits they have there at JSC, and what's one of your favorite things? For example, I like the Lunar Receiving Lab. That is so outstanding to see those four gigantic moon rocks there.
well, I would have to say it's probably the Rocket Park
Mm-hmm. Okay.
there. And there's a few stories about that.
Well, Gary is you're gonna enjoy a conversation with this man. He is a lessons learned expert. And our stay listeners, we love you out there. You're going to learn about the mission evaluation room called the MER. And he was a merman of the MER that problem solved all of the problems that came cropped up on the anomalies of any space flight in the Apollo era. That's Gary's wheelhouse there. And we're also going to talk about some of his jobs that he had at NASA of being he's written several things about uh, you were an Apollo sequencer system, but what I'm looking for is your lessons learned safety of astronauts on Soyuz, and then he did a lessons learned from 50 years in human spaceflight in April 2018. 4 years ago, you were finishing that up. So this is a man that is very involved in a lot of the safety areas of NASA, and we're going to talk about his a story he's got from Apollo 8. We will take you to the Merman room, the mission evaluation room, with you in a couple pictures there. He'll talk about that in Apollo 13. But Gary, tell us a little bit about where you grew up and how you got involved in the space business.
Okay, was born in Covington, Oklahoma, on a farm just outside of that town. That town's about 60 miles north of Oklahoma City. My dad worked for an oil field construction company, and so after he got out of being drafted there initially for World War II as a radio man, he worked for Celanese down in the Kingsville area. So I actually went to the first grade down in Kingsville, Texas. And then we traveled around some, but we always had the farm back near Covington. So later, when I was late grade school through high school and all, we were actually living there on the farm. And so my dad still worked for this construction company, gone a lot. So I was often doing the plowing of the fields and looking after the stuff on the farm. And then while I was in high school, uh, back when Sputnik went up, we
Mm-hmm.
all got enthused about the space program, and I particularly did. And so in my chemistry class, I even messed around with making some solid propellant. And that went all that way. We set that off one day. I didn't really know how it was going to go, but it smoked up things so bad that all the fire sensors went off in the schoolhouse. Needless to say, my teacher was a little upset with me that we had to evacuate school for
Really?
just because of my playing around. Uh,
So, what did you get paddled? Did you get set
No,
in the
no,
corner?
no.
I got paddled a lot. Okay,
I played dumb. We were in the chemistry lab, and I said, well, I didn't know exactly what, I knew this is going to be able to do. I was interested in space, and this was going to be some soft film, but I didn't really know what the results were. So I'm sorry.
well, we're talking with Gary Johnson. He spent a 32-year career with NASA at Johnson Space
40,
Center.
42.
42. Oh my gosh, my math is just escaping me. A safety expert, lessons learned guy. He's got so many things that he's had his fingers into. All of them are very fascinating. Deputy Director of Russian Projects for Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance, dealing with the Mir Space Station. And we're going to talk about the Mir Space Station because, as our Stay Curious listeners know, we celebrate our shuttle astronauts, and we had a shuttle mission 26 years ago, I think, launched to the space station to take up. They were bringing back. I know for sure they were bringing back Blaha and taking up Leninger this month in history. But but I want to thank everybody for joining us today on Facebook Live, YouTube, Twitch, and we are on Spotify Live. And this will be put on audio podcasts on Google and Apple. And Gary is in Clear Lake, Texas, outside of Houston, and I'll make sure you get a link to all that for your family and friends, Gary, to share
Okay.
as you're going to enlighten us a lot on an area. We're Kennedy Space Center here, of course, and not interviewed too many people from JSC, but we certainly are looking forward to what you've got to share with us here. I want to start with our slideshow by saying Gary retired in April 2006. That's 16 years ago, but you really haven't retired. And I'm going to show a picture of Gary is in the middle there. And this is a photograph taken in 2017 for the Apollo 1 remembrance at Johnson Space Center. Ellen Ochoa there was on the left, former astronaut. She was the second woman director and the first Hispanic. Glenn Looney, who, if you got a story or two about Glenn, launch director for Apollo, there's Gary in the middle. Walt Cunningham, astronaut, and Nicole Mann, another astronaut. Of course, Walt is Apollo 7. And wanted to mention, thank you, Marty Winkles, behind our console here. Gary, he was a Grumman lunar module electrical engineer. You guys may have crossed each other in the hallway going to the restroom somewhere during the Apollo era there. And our Trekkie techie, Jessica Galloway, thank you. She has helped us by pulling off the road in a Starbucks because of a crash on the causeway, 528 Causeway, to help us put our show here together. So we've had our own mission evaluation room things to solve here, Gary. As he's going to tell you some great stories here, and I'm going to shut up and get out of the way. But we wanted to set sort of that this guy is still used by NASA, okay? And what companies, you retire, car companies, food companies, whatever you're involved in, they just kind of kick you to the curb. NASA, in some instances, relies on their old horses, so to speak, to troubleshoot things. The next picture I have here, Gary, is you on the stage with Cunningham, Looney, and a man there just 5 years ago on your remembrance of our Apollo astronauts. We are going to remember them January 29th, as we always do at Sandpoint Park here in Titusville, with a very patriotic and reverent service. Tell us how little about this, Gary.
Okay, well, back at that time, even though the Cape was in charge of running the tests on Apollo 1 at that time, the Mission Control Center was up monitoring the test and getting all the data. And it turns out at that time, we didn't have a MIR per se. So we engineers got to go over and sit with our flight control counterparts in the backup staff support rooms at their consoles to follow the mission. Well, it turns out the testing was running late and so forth. And at 6:30 Cape time or 5:30 Houston time is when it occurred. But about 5 o'clock in Houston time, most of the flight control guys left to go home.
Hmm.
And so it turned out that time back in the staff support room, I was the only one on the EPS console because my flight control counterpart had actually left for the day.
Hmm.
And then Mort Silver, who was in flight operations and worked for Rockwell Space Division, he was on the ECS control. We were the only two on that particular room. Now, out in the front room, you still had Chris Kraft out there and Jerry Griffin and some others out there monitoring the test. And I think John Aaron was out there at the econ console. But
Hmm.
anyway, as we know, so I was actually on the headset and console when this all occurred.
Hmm.
And yes, that was very bad, trying time. You know, oddly enough, I was thinking, you know, the crew's in suits and all, maybe they're going to maybe be okay, you know, or something like that. But then I heard on the loop that the test conductor had called to have Chris Kraft go to a private line. And my heart sank then because I
Hmm.
thought that sounds like things are really bad,
Hmm.
which of course we always know it was.
Gary's talking. We're talking about the loss of Apollo 1, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee on January 27th, 1967. And here's another gentleman that heard it on the headset. John Tribe was John over here at our
Well,
Space
I
Coast.
know, John.
Yep, he's a great supporter of our museum, and I'm sure John Tribe's watching this, Gary. So he was another person that was on the headset for that. Did you know Ernie Rios?
Yes,
Ernie passed away about a year ago,
yeah,
and
I heard
he talked.
Charlie. I
Yeah,
think Charlie Mars told me about that.
yeah. So, well, thank you for sharing that. Anything else you wanted to say about that, Gary?
Well, briefly, Chris Kraft came back to the SSR and told us we're going to be replaying the data, and you guys are going to have to concentrate on looking at the data and see if we could identify the ignition source for this. And he also had closed the building and everything. And he said, you're not allowed to make any calls except one call to your wife to tell them you're not going to be home.
Hmm.
And just say that we had, you know, had a problem and we were not going to be home. Well, when I called home, the wife had already heard something on the news about it, so she knew it was bad. But anyway, I was there till the next morning. I didn't leave the building till the next morning.
Mm-mm.
But in the process of reviewing the data and correlating it back to when the crew reported fire, I did notice a large short on both main bus A and main bus B, the DC bus. And so that got me to thinking that if the short occurred on both main buses, that would say it must have been a dioded load, some load that was dioded to both buses, such that when it would short, it would affect both buses. And that's a great help because that minimized the number of loads. When I went back to the office the next day, it minimized the loads. So I wrote out and mapped out all of the dioded loads at least. And I didn't know it, but about at the end, towards the end of the week, I was directed to go down to the Cape and participate in the discussion. And I was actually the one charged with going in with a photographer and crawling through the vehicle and everything to look at all of the wiring to try to identify what the source is. And at that particular area on the left-hand lower side, it really was, everything was gone because metal and everything had burned up in that area. So you
Hmm.
couldn't really see, but we looked at closeout photographs just before the vehicle was closed out of what that area looked like. And I noticed that there was a wire bundle that was going under the lithium hydroxide door that's often open and closed, going over the water glycol lines and the lines on the floor, just below Gus Grissom's couch there, off to the side. And so I got to noticing that that was one of these diode loads that I identified ahead of time as being a possibility. And one of the photographs showed that there was a Teflon wrapped over protection cover that was put on that wire bundle as it went over these cables, the hard lines and stuff, to protect them. But I noticed in the very last photo before they closed out, that Teflon cover had slid down and was no longer protecting that wire going into that area.
Hmm.
And at that same time, we know there was motion in the vehicle where Gus was reaching around to change his comm headset because they were having comm problems.
Mm-hmm.
And the simulations show that to do that, you almost have to put your left foot down off the couch in that area. And of course, he had boots on. And
Whoa.
so there's you can't say for sure, but things add up. It's a possibility that he would step in that area, and that might have been the cause. We don't. Yeah, it's the only thing we know for sure is all the evidence points to the fact the fire started in that area, and so forth. And of course, that shows up in the report.
Well, Gary, that is an unreal report there. I know our Stay Curious followers out there like Tom Usiak and we got people all around the world. Robert Law in Scotland. How do you like that, Robert? Hearing about the Apollo 1 fire from Gary Johnson, who had his head inside that vehicle. And thank you for sharing that. I know it's not always easy to go back in time with that, Gary. And of course, the lessons learned were paid a heavy price, but we came out of it with a better vehicle, correct?
The big thing was to put hard covers on all of the wiring, and also to put a hard flooring in there. At the time, the Cape only had these foam pads down to protect. And of course, the foam itself was a bad source of materials not compatible.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to move to another photograph here. Oh, we've got a picture of course, you've got all kinds of memorabilia, I'm sure. This is the picture of the crew of Apollo 8, who are all alive, signed this lithograph to you. Sorry I didn't have it. Well, it's vertical. There's no up and down in space, so this would actually probably how they saw it going across there. Jim Lovell, Bill Anders, and Frank Borman signing it to you there. Tell us about those guys, and then I'm gonna have you segue into your story of Apollo 8 and Florida Flicker and Light. Your Florida Flicker and Light story there, Gary.
Well, I'm going to go back and talk a little bit about Apollo 7 because
Sure.
George Lowe, the program manager, said that that they had decided on Apollo 8 they want to try to go go to the moon because the LEM wasn't ready, and there's great concerns, of course, that we'd be taking a whole lot of risk because we'd end up putting men on top of a Saturn V and a spacecraft with very little previous history, and send them off to the moon, which took 3 days to get there and get back. So he made a statement that the Apollo 7 flight had to be almost perfect before we could go ahead and take the risk on Apollo 8. And even the Russians, of course, were accusing us of being too risky on that mission. Well, it turns out we had AC shorts on that Apollo 7 mission. The motor switches we used in the service module to switch the cryogenic fans on and off in the oxygen tanks were not hermetically sealed. They were only environmentally sealed. And as a result, they bled down on orbit to the low pressure area where those AC voltages would corona and arc out. And so every time one of those pressure cycles caused the switches to come on. It shorted out the AC buses, turned off the lights, turned off the fans in the spacecraft and everything.
Hmm.
So we quickly found out during the mission, though, if the crew went to manual on that and turned off the automatic system, we could be okay. And that's one reason the Apollo 7 mission went along just fine and everything. But after that mission, uh, because of that problem, I think is the reason the program manager, Apollo program manager, George Lowe, directed that he wanted an AC test run on every AC load and piece of equipment in Apollo 8 before we would launch. And my bosses, my boss told me I was the one to develop a test to go check out all of the AC equipment and loads on the Apollo 8 spacecraft at that time, which was out at pad 39
Right.
on the pad. Needless to say, I didn't argue with the management. Now, we did have two TV-1 spacecraft, the Apollo CSM for thermal vacuum testing, and it had man capability, was at JSC. So I actually wrote up the tests to check out all of the AC loads and did run it on two TV-1 at Johnson to give me some confidence that at least as far as the spacecraft went. But needless to say, I was very nervous when I went down to the Cape for a week to write up the test at the Cape because, I had no experience running the test. I'd been at the Cape, knew the people because I've been down there monitoring tests. Then these are tests that were developed by Space Division and NASA KSC engineers and so forth. So they were the experienced one in this field. So, and to this day, I don't know why I was chosen unless for some reason George Lowe wanted something totally independent. But anyway, I was sent to the Cape and you had to fill out these individual TPS sheets. Anybody that's been involved in testing know how that is. Test preparation sheets, and they were called TPSs. And so they're individual pages, carbons and all, and I had to write all those steps out. Well, when I got finished towards the end of the week there, that stack of TPSs was about 2 or almost 3 inches thick, okay? At the same time, I had about 6 or 7 signatures I had to go through to get them approved because there was a lot of signatures where we could go run the test spacecraft at the pad, okay? And it started out, of course, with the contractor engineers and management, and then went over to the NASA safety engineers and NASA engineers and management to all sign off. Well, as I started going through the signature chain, people would say, "Oh, well, we know you work with the right people, you do good work," and they'd thumb through it and they say, "Yeah," and they'd sign off. They didn't. And as I was going through that, I kept hoping somebody would stop me, that this young engineer from the Johnson Space Center coming in here to run a test on Apollo 8 at the pad, first man flight to the moon,
Mm-hmm.
never been here to run a test before, that surely somebody's going to check me out. And I wanted that.
Or give you a hard time, sure.
I was very concerned, even though I've been tried to be as careful as I could. I was very concerned that I still could have missed something. Well, anyway, I went through all the way through the signatures. Nobody checked. So all that in is made me extremely nervous. And of course, some special tests like that's always run third shift late at night. So it was nighttime. I was out at the launch pad at the very top in the white room. I was actually sitting on one of those great government chairs, white coat and cap on, with my procedure in my lap. And next to the hatch door was open to the command module, and the test crews were in there to run the test. And of course, the lights and everything were on in the white room and everything because it was nighttime. And about halfway through the test, all the lights went out in the White Room. I just about had a heart attack
I'd
thinking,
say.
I just blew the first mission to the moon.
Oh,
And then all of a sudden, I heard on the headset, facility power outage. Uh, and sure enough, I looked inside the hatch there. All the lights were on, everything was humming. So everything was just fine. And as the local people called it, there goes uh, Florida Flight and Flicker again, because back in the early days, there was a lot of electrical glitches and so forth that I wasn't aware of. But yeah,
imagine that in Brevard County, the delivery room of America's space age. All the lights are out. You are 300 feet in the White Room, and the only thing illuminated is the command module of Apollo 8. Wow,
that,
that is really cool. You're 300 and some feet up there. How'd you like that feeling?
oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
I was nervous going up that elevator while I was.
that's a great story there. That's a
And
great
then
story.
uh,
Did you
later,
tell did you tell
later,
the crew about that later and by chance when they autographed that for you?
no, I personally didn't actually tell the crew, but the management did present me with that uh, picture
Hmm.
signed by the crew because of the test.
Hmm.
I just, the crew themselves didn't know that test had been run, but the
Hmm.
management after the mission, the management told the Apollo 8 crew that they'd like to have a signed picture for this engineer that actually ran a test on your spacecraft before you launched. And then, of course, they were very happy to do that. And lucky I had that.
Hmm. That is neat. That is great. We're talking to Gary Johnson. He's outside of Houston in the suburbs of Clear Lake. And how's the fishing around there, sir? You said you go fishing with your grandkids.
On the grandkids.
What
Matter of fact, it's
what do you catch?
pretty good at times. Just fairly recently, about Thanksgiving, I have a grandson that came down. He wanted to be out in a boat and wanted to see about fishing because the last time he'd been down, we were out with him and he'd caught the biggest crab of all of us. And it thrilled him to death. So we were out fishing in the channel and with shrimp, live shrimp, and he just had put his hook in the line and wham. And it turned out to be a 3.5 pound sheep's head and really put up a fight for him.
Wow.
Oddly enough, it was actually a fairly cool day that day, but oddly enough, he was the only one that caught a fish. But thank goodness it was my 10-year-old grandson because
What's his name?
David. David.
David. All right. Well, we hope he stays curious and sees Grandpa telling these wonderful tales because, we all consider you here at the museum, Gary, a national treasure. And that's no joke. Just like Marty Winkle behind our computer here that worked on the Grumman, he looked out those triangular windows of the lunar module ascent stage as he was working. He was up in the slaw of the on the where the lunar module was on the gantry there. You were up a little bit higher, up above his head up there. I just think that's amazing that that's part of your job. Is well, you got to go do this check as the test project engineer, and by the way, take that elevator 300 feet up there, and try not
Well,
let
it's
your
actually my second trip.
really
Yeah, because AS 501,
okay
Apollo 501, I don't know if you remember, that was the very first Saturn V launch, full up
6. Yep.
Saturn V launch,
Yep.
okay, from the pad. And Don Arabian gets a call in the mirror that, hey, we got all this electrical and noise at the spacecraft and it's holding up our testing down here because nobody down here can figure out what the cause of this instrumentation noise is and everything. Okay. So Don grabs me since I was one of his lead for power system in the MER, and we flew down to the Cape right away. And I looked at the drawings of the grounding system because I got thinking, but if you got a noise problem, it's surely a problem with the grounding system. So I looked at the grounding system The drawings and the design looked very good. We had an I ground and an E ground. I ground for instrumentation, E ground for the electrical power stuff. And the drawing showed that those two grounding systems would stay isolated all the way down to the very ground to where you finally tied them into the ground system. So I got to the very top where the spacecraft was with the Apollo spacecraft engineer. I think it was somebody from the design shop. And I said, well, I want to physically walk down the and track the record of these two ground systems, ground wires. So as we went down to each level, and there's a bunch of levels, we'd go in and we'd open up a junction box and check that you had the E ground and I ground in that box. And there would be joining to another cable that's going on down, and the grounds were still isolated. Now I went all the way down the stack, and there was about, I don't know, it might have been 8 or 10 times we stopped to check. And very down at the very base, down in that lower crawler that takes you out there with the very last box, junction box, I opened it up, and lo and behold, the I ground was not connected to the E ground, which would be connected to the ground. Because that was the point that you should be connected to the ground. Okay, both of them should be connected to the ground. So that meant that I ground was open all the way up the stack, was acting like an antenna. So I told the engineer that was there with me, or maybe it was a technician. I can't remember now whether it was a technician. Obviously, they were very embarrassed that here this connection wasn't connected. And I said, well, that's all right. It's a very easy fix. All you have to do is connect it up and you'll be okay. And sure enough, and the test went along fine. But that was the very first time I was at the top of the Saturn V.
I mean, just think about these little glitches like that with the gigantic, the whole, everything involved in the Saturn V, and it's a wire that's not grounded, and you had to trace it all the way down. Well, we're going to talk about the mermen. Here is the room full of mermen. I'm showing the one where you're actually off to the left in the picture there, Gary. He's not really visible here. The back of his head, I think, is. But these are the men that were in the mission evaluation room.
It should be the one that shows me in a striped shirt on the left-hand side of the table at the very back there. It's a black and white photo.
Yeah. There you are. There you are. Yeah. You are at the table. He's the next to the last one, Marty.
The people on
everyone's got a white shirt on except for you.
Right. I didn't get the dress code.
You didn't get the dress. You don't have the thin tie. You don't have the shirt.
Right.
Same right back there. Yeah, that's you right there. That's Gary Johnson. How old are you, Gary? That's 1969, right?
During Apollo 11.
Yeah,
so
Apollo 11.
So I was born in 1940. I was 29.
29, which is so much. You were like one of the older guys in the room. Basically.
Not there, but I was a little bit of the younger. Most of the people on that side were older than me. But on that left-hand side, you had the engineers responsible for the command service module, electrical power system. And then over on the right-hand side was the lunar module engineers.
At the same table, folks. Same table there.
And on the just directly across from me, his head is turned looking at the data on the screen. There is Art Campus. He was the lunar module subsystem manager for EPS.
Okay.
And then on the right, at the very front there with his back is, well, close to you there is Owen Morris. Owen Morris was the program manager, NASA program manager for the lunar module. So people working on the LIM would probably know Owen Morris would know him, but he's in that picture there.
Well, here's a quote about what this room was like, because this is the real bullpen of where the problems were solved as they cropped up on our wonderful missions to the moon. And this is a quote from shuttle flight director Milt Heflin, who is responsible for the recovery of the Apollo spacecraft, a splashdown. He said this: compared to the calm, ordered, military-like correctness in mission control, in the mirror, there were times it seemed like everyone's hair was on fire. Can you relate to that, Gary?
I can relate to that. And above the fray was
Don,
Don, our leader.
Don Arabian, and we're going to talk about. I pulled a picture up of Don here because, of course, he passed away a couple years ago. He lived here on the Space Coast. I've read several stories about, written about him. I am showing a picture of Don taken about 4 years ago in our control room. He's got that big smile on his face with that big mouthful of teeth there, Gary. You've seen that big smile there. And one of our well, not sad, being 95 and having the great life that he had. He was over this MER mission evaluation room, and the so-called mermen there, and they took a lot of. You look at the telephones there on the table, the computers on the wall. Everyone had to share this stuff,
We didn't have any
and come up with information to. And Don was a very loud, boisterous, and demanding boss. But I read in the story he could chew you out in the morning, but then at lunch he'd be offering you his apple out of his lunch pail. Is that accurate about Don?
Yes, that's accurate about Don. He demanded perfection, and you better know your technical stuff. And when we're trying to solve problems, if whatever scenario you came forward with, if it didn't match all of the data, he sent you to the showers to figure it out. He says, whatever problem is here, it's got to match all of the data that we've got, you know.
I heard,
So,
yeah. It was, if you came up to him, I read and says, "Well, I think it could be the main bus." He would say, "I don't care what you think. I want the data on
right,
there."
exactly,
And
exactly.
well,
By the way,
we're gonna see another picture of Don here. I've gone to the picture of you in the blue shirt during Apollo 13, I believe.
right, right.
Tell us about that and your involvement 13.
Okay, let
And,
me start with mentioning something before the Apollo 13 mission. I got concerned that, you know, in the command module, we have a battery charger that allowed us to charge up the entry batteries before entry. And I got to thinking it'd be really nice if we needed to top off the batteries in the lunar module. So we ought to have a way to connect up the command module battery charger in the main bus and be able to connect that up to the lunar module. So our campus, the lunar module EPS manager was we were all in the same office. So we got together and we together wrote up this procedure, going through the drawings and all, how the crew could connect up a line to go from the command module to the lunar module. And we documented those procedures in memos at the time. Well, during the Apollo 13 mission, when we had the problem, and by the way, those photos there are actually taken shortly after the problem. So there's actually photos from the color NASA film crew that came over to show the work going on in the mirror. So there's just, and at the time, then we were going to suddenly be dependent on everything in the lunar module. So Art and I got thinking, gee, you know, the procedure we wrote up to connect up the buses, we just need to go get that and bring it back to the mirror because we need to do that in reverse. In other words, we need to be able to send power from the lunar module back to the command module, and we would need to do that prior to reentry and all to help out with the. So I had that procedure there, and we had to write up kits and stuff to get the information over to the crew. But then it was a very hectic time. The man on the phone there with the back to you is actually the Grumman lunar module EPS manager. Okay, because the spur room had not only NASA engineers and managers in it supporting the mission, it also had the contractors. So you had Rockwell Space Division in there for the CSM, and then you had the managers for the Grumman Bethpage lunar module. Oh, that's where both of us operated out of. And of course, that mirror limb manager's on the phone right away, getting back to the plant because they were having to do so much testing back at Grumman to see how long we could operate those systems.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, we're very familiar with our Grummies here on the Space Coast. Marty Winkle's one of them, and he spearheads the 50th reunion of Apollo 13 that they're going to do 52 years later because of the COVID. That is the last weekend of January here. So, you know, was Fred Hayes involved with this? Because Fred knew the lunar module better than anybody else, undoubtedly. That was another kind of fortunate circumstance. Did you deal with him or any of the other?
Not, no, I didn't. But after some years ago, I got with Fred, and him and I did some talks together, because I was able to talk about our work in the mirror while he talked about the mission and everything. It
Mm-hmm.
turns out the engineers did not get a chance to work very closely with the Apollo astronauts. It was mainly the flight controllers and so forth. And we were kind of always, there was only a couple of engineers that would take the effort to work closer with the engineers, and I got to know them better. John Young was one of them, who
Mm-hmm.
was the best engineer in NASA. And the other one was Walt Cunningham. Walt
Hmm.
Cunningham. So I got to know Walt a lot later. But during the actual missions themselves, there was not any real interface with the astronauts. On the other hand, Murr was the focus of the investigation after Apollo 13 to find what was wrong. And it turns out Neil Armstrong was the chairman of our investigation panel that they had there in the Murr. So that's the first time I met and dealt with Neil Armstrong.
Mm-hmm. Of course, outstanding engineer, right?
Oh,
In
yeah.
your circles there. So the assessment of the lessons learned from Apollo 13 to continue on to 14, Gary. Number one, you were right there in the trenches. Did you think they were going to make it back alive?
Initially, we were not sure at all. There was cases where you saw people had tears in their eyes and so forth because initially the numbers weren't looking good at all. So no, it wasn't until a few days there before we begin to think we got a chance here,
Hmm.
you know. So
Well, that's and then we recovered from that, and Alan Shepard led us back into space with Apollo 14. So
right.
very good. And Edgar Mitchell was a great friend of our museum here too, by the way, in there. And Marty's going to see Walt Cunningham in 2 weeks. Oh, Walt's not coming. Oh, he's shaking his head. Walt's not coming. So we're well, good. Let's we love that we're talking to Gary Johnson. He's been I'm kind of nicknaming him the lessons learned expert for our Stay Curious listeners here. He's spent a tremendous career, 42 years, not 32. I cheated him 10 years there on our little thing on the bottom. But the next picture, there he is, the safety and mission assurance badge, it looks like, or a little talk that you did. I pulled up there. But you had a lot to do with the safety assurance things on the Mir space station, the 4 years that we sent 9 missions to Mir with the space shuttle, 7 crew exchanges, and you're still talking Russian and listening to the Russians. Tell us what you were doing this morning, Gary, and then we'll talk about the Mir space station. I've got a picture of it here docked with one of the orbiters taken from one of the Soyuz. But what were you doing this morning?
Okay, this morning, early this morning, starting at 7 o'clock, and it lasted almost to 10 o'clock, is what we call the Approach, Rendezvous, and Docking Working Group, the Space Station Approach, Rendezvous, and Docking Working Group. Tom Erkenswitch is the chairman of that working group, and I sit in on his telecons, and I take notes. Then I put out a written version of those notes and from the meeting and everything, and send that to the flight control the flight safety office back at SAIC, and that so I'm the one that has to get up at 6 o'clock or earlier than 6 o'clock to get ready for the telecon and go put that out for those. So they're more than happy to let me do that and provide them a written report on what we covered.
But that's the Russians
Yeah,
teleconference in there, not and you're
yeah.
listening into the report to Star City.
Rocket Space, Rocket Space Corporation, Nergia, and both their engineers and their flight controllers, and then also one of the engineers from the Cosmonaut Training Center, which is out there at Star City. They all participate in that telecon.
Well, still helping America's space programs. Thank you very much. That's like I said, what companies out there, want to use some of their retired staff? Not many, right, Gary?
Well, that's probably true, but yeah, the uh, the Jennifer and Lewis formed this. They got a minority-owned business called J&P Technologies Incorporated, and that's who I'm actually hired by to support part-time.
Mm-hmm.
And they're a subcontractor to the SAIC Safety and Mission Assurance contract with the Johnson Space Center Safety and Mission Assurance. And that piece of that I support is the flight safety office part.
Okay. Well, talk a little bit about this segment of the important middle time of our shuttle, 135 shuttle flights, the where we docked with the Russian space station. I've got some pictures I'm going to show here of it. I have a picture here, Gary, of the 7 astronauts who were on it. For my Stay Curious audience, standing in the back there is we've got that's Andy Thomas, and of course in center Shannon Lucid, and Mike Foale is on the right. He was on there when there was a crash of a cargo ship. We're going to see pictures of the results of that. You got Norm Thagard there seated down, John Blaha, Jerry Lininger, and David Wolf. And so there was some concerns where Jerry Lininger was on there when there was a fire, which was an oxygen tank that replenishes. I got a picture now I'm showing Gary of Shannon Lucid in the space in the mirror doing a workout there, and another one of Thagard there in his shorts and socks and white T-shirt. Kind of emphasize how cramped it was. Then a big picture I'm showing everybody of the whole complex, what a mishmash of solar panels and modules. Here's what it looks like going from those modules. They have a lot of airflow vents to go from one area to the other. They're supposed to be able to close these hatches within a few seconds. And as you can see, with all the cables going in them and out, when they had that problem with the Spectre part when it crashed, and there is the part where the cargo ship crashed into it. So Gary, tell us a little about the Mir Space Station and your involvement as safety assurance.
Okay, I was selected to be the NASA co-chairman of what we call the Joint Safety Assurance Working Group. My counterpart was Boris Sotnikov from RISC in Nergia. And this was formed along the lines of what we had. We first worked with the Russians during the Apollo Soyuz project, and we were organized into working groups back then. And I was on working group 4. So that was back in 1975. And so, and for the first time, this allowed me to get back to see some of the Russian engineers I'd worked with back then that I didn't know before. But anyway, we were responsible. And by the way, that first early on, Tommy Holloway was the Shuttle Mir program manager roughly at that time. And Boris Sotnikov and I had the responsibility of drafting up the safety procedures and documents and how to organize our work And Boris Sotnikov outlined a great plan on one sheet of paper that showed how the documents would flow down to getting ready for launch and which ones they ought to be. And that was a really good plan, and I quickly bought into what he had. Anyway, in going through those, this is one time I got to work a lot with the astronauts, first being involved heavily in the safety of their mission and being one of the managers. So I got to know pretty well almost all of those shuttle near crewmen that you mentioned there, which was good for a time. Uh,
How about
so
Shannon Luce's birthday, by the way, is tomorrow.
yeah,
Yeah.
let me give you a little snippet about what one thing that we found out that caused us a lot of problems as Americans when we went over there. The Russians gave all of their lessons orally, and their tests were oral. Whereas in the US, almost everything is given out, you know, written tests, and you make presentation and written view graphs and everything like that. And it's one reason that Norm Thagard and especially uh, our crews, when they went over, actually had little, not only learned Russian, but they had trouble with the way, the fact that they had to listen to oral lectures and they had to give an oral test and so forth. It was good
Mm.
to them. So, but, and so Shannon Lucid was up on the station one day, and the two cosmonauts were getting ready to go out on EVA. And they told her, well, when we're out on EVA, you got to do this and that and so forth if the ground calls up, okay? And Shannon said, whoa, wait a minute. I've got to write this all down. And the Russians said, no, we'll tell you and you'll remember. And that right there showed this difference we have in working. We're very used, for example, if somebody tells me a phone number, I won't remember it 5 minutes later.
Mm-hmm.
If I have a chance to write the phone number down, just going through the motions of writing the phone number down, I'll remember it longer. It's something about in our society, in class, we've grown up to where it was written. In their society, it's all verbal. And by the way, you find out working with the Russians, they have outstanding memories. You tell them one thing, they remember it. And somebody lectures to them, they remember it. But that until Shannon gave that story there, that's when the light bulb finally went on about me and my work, because I was doing the same thing. I was wondering why, why, you know, they seem to think we could remember things right away if they told us. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
going
Yeah.
through things, and we always had to give these presentations. When they briefed us on the mirror, they just go up, they stood up and orally talked. They didn't have
Wow.
charts or anything. We
Really?
gave up the other way. But that little example of Shannon telling that story about what happened, that I suddenly realized that's our culture over here. And we need to so I tell people that are working with the Russians, you need to understand that they're always can remember things very well and they'll tell you, but you'll have to explain to them why it is that you got to have it written out and have it.
That is very interesting. Who knew that? Stay curious, listeners out there. Uh, that would be hard. Yes, I want a little notebook with me to jot down a few notes here, like I do in front of me here, to jog my memory about things we want to talk about. That'd be
Right.
so difficult. Let's get uh, there is, I don't know if it's urban legend or not, but it's rumored that Dan Golden, NASA administrator, made the decision the night before whether David Wolf was going to stay on the Mir space station on the shuttle that launched him up there, which he did. And then Andy Thomas became the last one on the Mir on there. Was there any were you in on any of that with NASA Administrator Golden wanting to pull us out of the Mir program?
No, well, our group being the safety working group, we were asked many times by our management, and there was a lot of publicity about how can you come up. Well, Borsotnikov and I had carefully gone through everything that happened with the collision with the Progress. After all, that's what we're talking about here. That occurred first.
Mm-hmm.
And, previous to that, there'd been a lot of talk or thinking on the U.S. side and by the general public that this old mirror station is dangerous and all that. And they have these problems, and periodically they were having problems with power and so forth on board the station. And now we had this situation occur where almost one of our guys was lucky to be alive, and the crew was lucky to be alive, because when that module depressed, as you pointed out, there was wires going down to that Spectre thing, and before they could put in the cover to close the hatch real quick and isolate, they had to take their pocket knife out and cut the wires, physically cut the wires to clear the hatch.
I'm showing some of them. They look pretty thick there too.
Yeah. So they were mainly instrumentation wires for some instrumentation, oddly enough, we had on a U.S. experiment up there.
Hmm.
Anyway, that did that. Well, at that time, internal to NASA and publicity wise, the press and so forth, they were very critical for us wanting to. Matter of fact, most people wanted to either stop the shuttle mirror program or not go up anymore or anything else. And so I think that environment is maybe what led, because a lot of that pressure would have been on Dan Golden, but I was not involved in his actual decisions.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of politics between non-space people about this, I would say, huh?
Yes, that's what I'd say.
Yep. And well, we've been talking with Gary Johnson here for about an hour, a NASA and Johnson Space Center engineer for 42 years, a lessons learned expert. I've got a little picture here of in our eBay. We offer these coins that have a piece of the Mir space station in them to show the it's the Mir NASA emblem there, Gary, and on the back of it, it's got the contains metal from the Mir on there, and that's a $25 item, but nice keepsakes of this moment of history. And there again is the picture of the Mir. Of course, it came down about 10 years ago. Gravity eventually brought it down, and they deorbited it. Gary, we've got our beautiful space station that I'm showing a picture of right now with the Earth in the background. And then I'm showing another photograph. Stay curious, watchers. This is the Chinese space station, Tiangong Heavenly Palace. And this is what it's going to look like at the end of the year. They've got one of the segments long ways, and they're going to go across with two more segments here. Gary, what do you know about those Chinese? They seem awful busy here in space the last few years, landing their first one-and-done shot on Mars and a lander, and then bringing back some of the moon.
No, the only thing I know is what everybody else knows that's out there in the press and news reports and so forth. I don't know anything beyond that. And of course, even on my part-time job, it's mainly dealing with the work going on to the International Space Station right now, rather than what that is. I might want to point out, though, that Frank Culberson was the Shuttle Mir program manager of Phase 1 ISS, they called it, during the time we talked about here on the collision. He sent me over to Russia right away
Oh.
to be involved in that investigation. So I was out at Star City for the first time listening to the where they this brings up a good lessons learned. One of the problems with our space program for safety engineers is we don't keep track of or record crew errors, especially during a mission where a crewman has made a mistake. The Russians do that. And so as a result, if you're a safety or reliability engineer, you can find out from them at a pretty high, what's the probability of a crew error occurring with the system, and how often is that, and so forth. Well, while I was there at Star City, they were able to pull up the training records, which would show passing and failing and what all they did of the near commander at that time, and also what he was doing in flight and so forth. And of course, eventually that review and design review with our Tom Stafford being involved in that review as well, pointed out that the commander of the MUR at that time was given extremely limited data and so forth in order to pull off that mission of trying to dock the Progress without any decent data or so forth. So it's not really his fault per se. But
Gary, yeah, go ahead, sir.
the thing I just wanted to point out, though, that Boris Sotnikov, because I've always been asking the safety business, okay, do we have a number for what percentage during a space mission is due to anomalies or due to crew error? So I asked my counterpart, Boris Sotnikov, because he often was able to confide in me. I said, in your program, how often? And Boris Sotnikov said, oh, about 10% of all, 10 to 15% of all mission anomalies, you can pretty much relate to crew error. And they got an extensive database for that. So when I came back, I asked some of our shuttle commanders and crewmen, like I talked to Brian O'Connor and Jim Witherby and so forth, who were shuttle commanders. I asked them that term. They stopped and thought for a minute, and they said, that number sounds about right.
Really? Oh, wow.
Yeah, yeah.
So they're going
So they actually felt that was, that they'd seen that even on the missions they were in command of.
10 to
So
15% of the problems are crew errors. Gary,
10
I've read that the pay grade of these cosmonauts is based on their performance, and that one of the incentives maybe for this cosmonaut to manually dock the Progress instead of let the automation do it was that he was going to get a 1,000 ruble bonus or something for doing that. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I don't know what the amount was, but
Yeah.
you're exactly right. They got bonuses based on their performance and so forth. Yes.
Right. So they would want to dock manually instead of autonomously, and would probably try to maybe, push it to the
But
edge.
he did complain about some of the constraints put on him at the time. Now, he went ahead and did it, but he actually told the ground he was quite concerned.
And what was coming in was a Progress spaceship that had their supplies,
Well,
and it wasn't lined up properly, and it crashed into one
well,
of the
the
modules.
problem is normally he would have data on range rate and various data from that Progress through their core system. The Russians, in order to save money, because the Kur's hardware on Progress always gets thrown away and it was being built in the Ukraine, they were trying to change. They didn't have that data on. He was not receiving any of the data because they had that Kur system turned off. So that was a big disadvantage. He was strictly having to go on this visual display, grid on it to do that with. And of course, Tom Stafford told the investigation committee that it would almost be impossible to try to pull off that type of rendezvous and docking without that data. And yet you on the ground, because they were initially blaming the commander for all the problems, they said you on the ground for not allowing him or doing that mission without that data was one of the major factors.
That's some fascinating information there from Gary Johnson. We hope to be seeing the General Tom Stafford in a couple of weeks at the Grumman reunion. He's still slated to come, right, Marty? And he's 91 years old. And of course, I know he speaks fluent Russian, great friends with Alexei Leonov, who passed away almost a year and a half ago, I think. Well, Gary, take us out here. We've enjoyed a nice long conversation with you. Tell your friends to watch it on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Spotify, and we're going to air this on Google and Apple. And our oral histories, as such, like this, are presented by the Marie Louise G. West Endowment Fund that helped us buy the computer equipment, Gary, to broadcast this program. And actually, we are being broadcast in Normandy, France. Hello, Ophelia. She's there. And we've got friends in New Zealand, Dan Salzwittel, who I mentioned.
Wow.
Robert Law is in Dundee, Scotland. We've got people in Egypt and all over America watching us, including Dave Stang up there freezing to death in Michigan. We love them all because they love hearing these stories, Gary, from people like yourself, who we truly feel are national treasures to one of the brightest things you can think about our country's ever done, our space program. Tell us a little bit about the lessons learned in 50 years of human space flight. And he's wrote a big You wrote a big report on this, and just kind of, in general, are we headed in a good direction with these private companies?
Yes, and the un, there's not as much oversight though, and that brings up a concern, of course. Yeah, the NASA engineers aren't allowed to get right involved in all of the uh, design and testing like we did in those Apollo days and so forth. So it's a lot of hands off and review the hazard reports from the distance or safety hazard reports and analysis. At the same time, the companies themselves right now, the commercial companies, are highly motivated because they know the focus is on them and they sure don't want to be involved in losing somebody in their spacecraft. So there's a high level of work and rigor. And SpaceX, I've been extremely impressed with how rigorous they are in testing. So much in these later years, people had tended to go to a lot of modeling, mathematically modeling instead of testing because it was so much cheaper to do. But Spacecraft is one of these companies that relies a lot on good old fashioned testing. And they use that testing to improve their modeling that they do. And so that's a good lessons learned for any of these new people coming into the program.
But we watched one launch this morning, another Falcon 9 taking 105 satellites to space from the size of I guess, a toaster to a refrigerator. Beautiful launch this morning, and they landed for the 102nd time that Falcon 9 first stage, this time at the Space Force property.
Wow.
What do you think
Well,
about that, Gary?
well, last fall I was asked by a spacecraft SpaceX engineer. They'd like me to do a briefing on a report I was involved in terms of manual override, crew manual, the history of manual crew override in human spacecraft, because because there's so much automation on the SpaceX spacecraft, there's very little backup manual capability for the crew. And so they get a lot of questions and concerns from crew members that fly about, okay, well, if the computer fails or this doesn't work, do I have a way that I can get us out of trouble? And so I was actually asked to give a presentation to, and it turned out to be like almost 100 SpaceX engineers and all listened in on that report I'd written. Because in the report, I mentioned a lot of the missions during Apollo and Skylab and ASTP and so forth, where the crew's involvement was two things. Crew's involvement helped save the mission, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And then I covered some of those cases where crew error caused a problem as well, that I was personally aware of, even though those crew errors don't often show up in these NASA reports per se. Uh, and and as a result of that, I point out some design criteria that, okay, if you're going to have crew override capability, you got to make sure the crew would have time to react. They've got proper displays to identify what the problem is and proper training and so forth to be able to utilize that. And so there's a level of I don't know, 8 or 9, 10 things that you must consider or do if you want to implement manual crew override. And of course, in that report, I emphasize the importance of that because we've had so many cases in the past where the automated system, even the Russians know that, that's the reason they got manual docking capability. That's also like there's two areas that SpaceX has manual capability for the crew. One is manual docking to back up their automatic. They also have the capability to do a manual abort, which we always had the capability to do on Mercury and Apollo and so forth, the capability to reach over. And the Russians, unfortunately, came close to losing someone on the pad because they had a Soyuz launch where they had a fire break out in the launch vehicle that ended up interrupting the electrical lines, where this booster itself monitors can initiate an automatic abort. Those wires were disabled, and yet the crew were sitting on top and knew they had the fire going. It turns out the control center had to quickly send a command, which took two guys rotating keys to send the command to abort, and they aborted off the pad and were saved because of that case. But that's an example there where they really needed manual capability because if there had been a glitch with that ground command, it had all been over.
I hear you. Wow, that's what a fascinating life you have led, Mr. Gary Johnson, and still giving back from the Apollo era 50 years ago to SpaceX, talking to them about their manual overrides. This is we're so blessed that you're doing this for us. I think for our space world here, and I know our Stay Curious people are fascinated. We've gone well over an hour, and that's okay. I want to ask you one more question. You're there on the on the Texas coast. You see that gigantic Elon Musk starship that looks like something out of a Jules Verne movie that you and I watched as kids, and that is what we're going to land on the moon. What do you think about that, Gary?
Well, that's really something. That's really something. And of course, he's planning to land that on Mars as well.
Well, what do you think? Is it a reliable vehicle? You think they're going to build?
I think he'll make sure it is. I've been very impressed with the reliability of just the SpaceX we're launching and the success he's had. And I think that goes back. One, he builds a lot of things in house and does the design work, and he's got a lot of rigor in what that's being done. Bill Gerstenmaier, a former really sharp engineer with NASA and flight controller and headquarters, now works out at SpaceX.
Yeah,
Glad to hear that.
that was a good move. One of your friends, I'm sure.
Yeah, and matter of fact, Bill said he even said on that briefing I gave to him out there.
Hmm.
So,
Well, that looks good. You make me feel better about that actually, because I'm sure there's a lot of local news about it there, Houston area and the Boca Chica, not Boca Chica. What do they call it? Is it
yeah, yep,
Yeah,
that's it.
Boca Chica? Okay, is near you guys. So, well, Gary, is there anything we didn't talk about that you'd love for our American Space Museum followers to know about you or your career?
Well, started out, like I said, Oklahoma State University. They did well, pretty good this year.
Yeah,
Also, I met
football.
my wife, Coanne Johnson, on a blind date at Oklahoma State. She
Okay.
she was in a women's dorm back there, and we're talking about 1960 and 61 time frame. She was a freshman, and I was a sophomore. I was in a fraternity, and one of my wife's roommates came and was talking to some of my fraternity brothers I was with, and said, "Does anybody do anything Saturday night?" And I said, "I'm not doing anything." And she said, "Good, because my roommate doesn't have a date to our dorm dance." And
Okay.
so I went, and that's where I met my wife for the first time. We danced, had a good time, and been married ever since 1963. So many, many years.
Wow. That's
Got
coming up on
uh,
60 years.
got some great sons, grandkids, daughter, and even now have a great grandson, great granddaughter. So, and then I came directly out of Oklahoma State University with a double E degree down here to NASA at the time.
Well, we
Thank
can't wait for your grandkids and everybody to see this wonderful conversation with you, Gary. We certainly appreciate all that you shared. Everybody that came in late on this, you need to go at the beginning, hear his comments about the Apollo 1 tragedy, that he was right there, flown there to evaluate. Gary, you're really seriously a national treasure, and your lessons learned expert that you are, I hope those lessons go on for another 50 years to help people travel in outer space.
Okay, thank you.
Well, you're welcome. And I'm going to thank Marty Winkle and Jessica Galloway, who was off out of our studio today, helping us immensely. And we'll review this and do a lessons learned because we did this on a Google Meets instead of Zoom. And Gary, just again, thank you, and thank you, Charlie Mars, your friend, for hooking us up with you. He's our godfather here at the museum. He's
Great
doing,
friend of mine, and
yeah.
first guys I worked with in electrical power. He was one of my mentors at the early Apollo days.
Well, he's been one of mine here navigating this nonprofit world that we're involved in, and we're so blessed to be part of, and because we're blessed to talk to great space workers like you. So, on behalf of our whole museum here and Gary Johnson, I'm going to say that I'm Mark Marquette, and we will see you tomorrow with Triple T and Tales from the White Room to bridge the space between us. Thank you.
Thank you.